This video reviews the Victorian period, which is right after the Romantic Age in 1832, going through Victoria's rule. She began ruling actually in 1837 and ending in 1901 at her death. Now, our final unit, unit number 6 in our literature book, includes both the Victorian era as well as the modern and postmodern eras, the 20th and 21st century units. But we're going to, for the purposes of the introductions, have separate introductions on the Victorians and then on the 20th century unit. William IV died in 1837 after he had ruled 7 years, and Victoria, his 18-year-old niece, became queen. 3 years later, she married Albert, a German prince, and as prince consort, Albert gave her valuable advice until he died in 1861. So Victoria outlived him by 40 years and was really never the same after that, and her prime ministers had to take more of a lead in running the country. The Victorian age, though, was a time of great expansion. Mark Twain commented during the Diamond Jubilee, that's the 60th anniversary of her rule, that British history had moved farther ahead since Victoria than in all the rest of the 2,000-year history put together. If we take a look at her ancestry, we see that she was a granddaughter of the one we fought against in the American Revolutionary War, George III. Now, back in her day, and really before her day, when we became a country in the 1700s, Paris had been really the world capital. Anything important that was going on happened in Paris. That's why Jefferson and Franklin are always visiting France, to go to Paris for some treaty signing ceremony or some other kind of ceremony. But in the Victorian age, in the 19th century, London really becomes the world capital. I think we can say that in the 20th century, New York and Washington, D.C. were the main centers of influence. New York for the economic capital of the world, Washington, D.C. for the political capital. What's going to happen in the 21st century? We'll just have to wait and see. This is a long time period, so historians tend to divide it into good, or rather bad, good, and bad. And the dates will differ depending on the book you look in, but the early period we can call the time of trouble and famine, especially the potato famine, in which many Irish people immigrated to the United States. The middle period, a time of prosperity and power. And then later on, after the British Empire had spread all over the planet and kind of forgot about things at home, they had a decay of their values and influence. Because Victoria lived during this long period, many aspects of life are called Victorian, such as architecture and painting and writing, but Victoria really had very little to do with any of those things. Perhaps the concern of social problems is one of the most common themes in their writing, especially seen in the writings of Charles Dickens. But the people in the Victorian era wrote about many, many different things. Over the years, Britain tried to continue her advance toward a more democratic government. After slavery was abolished in the British colonies, the Liberal Party brought about improvements in the Church of England and in local government. To maintain support, the Conservative Party improved the conditions of factories. Child labor laws were enacted, and the 10 Hours Act of 1847 tried to accomplish what the old Reform Bill of 1832 had not been able to accomplish, and that was limiting women and children's work hours to no more than 10 hours a day. The city wage earners, though, were still not happy, because all men still could not vote. In 1838, a voting rights movement called the Chartist movement asked for all men to be given the right to vote and for members of Parliament to receive a regular salary. They wanted assurances that when the common people ran for office one day, they could survive with a salary base already there. In 1867, finally, men in city limits were given the right to vote since they had to pay city tax. Finally, the Reform Bill of 1884 gave all adult males in Britain the right to vote. The Education Act of 1870 set up elementary schools financed by the government. And examinations were also introduced in that Education Act for government employment, so people could prove that they were truly qualified for a government job. Trade unions became legal in 1871, giving the workers more of a say-so in their working conditions. In 1874, Benjamin Disraeli, the powerful prime minister, began Victoria's race of control for much of planet Earth. Now, at this time, the power structure in the world was organized like this. Britain, France, and Germany were the most powerful countries in the world. Behind them were some older colonial powers. I think we could probably put Belgium in there as well. Belgium, Spain, Portugal, and Holland. And three newly industrialized countries, Italy, Japan, and the United States. And if you take a look at that list, you see that to a great degree, these are the major players in World War I, and then later some of them in World War II as well. Of course, among the big three imperialist powers, Britain came out the biggest winner. And one of the lands it held very tightly was India. Before Victoria had taken the throne, the historian Macaulay had set up translator schools in India. He called it his Indian Committee of Public Instruction, so that young Indian men could be employed by companies moving there once they learned English. In 1856, Great Britain, though, was at war with Russia and China, so they needed their troops withdrawn from India. They appointed Indian leaders as low-grade officers acting as military police. These men were called sepoys. Well, at the time, the British introduced a new kind of rifle, with the magazines to be loaded in the rifles. And the magazine cartridges were packed in grease. They didn't have little styrofoam pellets and things that we have nowadays, so they packed things in lard. Well, the Hindus heard it was cow grease, and they would not load them. The Muslims heard it was pig grease, and pig was considered an unclean animal to the Muslims, and they would not load their rifles. So you have a whole army of men who won't load their rifles. Well, the British said that that was completely illogical, that they were going against the empire, and they ended up executing a number of sepoy leaders, and that did not help the British relationship with the people of India. But what the British actually started doing was buying out as many Indian companies as they could find, and the biggest Indian company was the East India Company, which is a major import-export trade route company, and Britain ended up controlling most of the shares in the East India Company. Of course, India finally got its independence in the 20th century, but English is still a major language spoken there, and many English customs are still practiced in India. Wages began to thrive during this period. A leisure class thrived. Britain had control of much of the world. You can see right here, they controlled India, Canada, Australia, many Pacific islands, New Zealand, many African countries all the way from the north all the way to the south, Caribbean islands, other lands. And as we said in a previous video, the importance to us is that our language had spread all over the globe, and more people were learning English and considering English truly to be the world language. More people may speak Chinese than English on the planet, but most of those are concentrated in one area. But if you talk about a language that is all over the planet, English would be the one that you would have to give that credit to. The Victorians really did not excel in music or painting during this time. They had a lot of old Romantic age painters and musicians that were still very prominent, but their literature became popular all over the world, especially with the novels of Charles Dickens and the poetry of Alfred Lord Tennyson.